There's upgrading, and then there's upgrading. You can run your stock power cable on your hi-fi gear, or you could run this power cable on your hi-fi gear. I'm going to tell you the 10 differences I heard when upgrading from a stock to this. So today we're talking about upgrading power cables. This is something I've done with different cables at different price points over the years. And you know, we all have these cheap cables that come with the equipment. Then I decided, okay, let's see what a real upgrade does. And today we're looking at the Stealth Dream 2020 tunable power cable. Now, why is it tunable? Because as some of the other Stealth cables I've talked about, it has this magic piece. And yes, I refer to this as magic because what you do is you put this in your system and you start at one end, and then listening to tracks you're very familiar with, you keep sliding it. I start off in 3-inch increments and keep going and keep going and keep going until I get the sound that I like. And then I actually go beyond it and come back and see if that is the best place. And we're gonna go ahead and then move it down into 2-inch, then 1-inch, then 1/2 inch, and you're gonna get it just right. And as is true with all Stealth cables, custom carbon fiber connectors here, handmade in the USA. And it is, as my wife refers to, it is literally the size of a radiator hose. And it has the special, if you go to the Stealth website, which I'll link to below, they're going to talk about how they've got the individual type cables in here, how they've got them twisted, and the strands that they use, and their actual way in which, one of the ways that they get the sound and performance that they do out of them. And I'll actually put a picture up here in the video real quick now for you. The other thing I want to say is I have, between this cable, and this thing really is absolutely ginormous. And I also saw their Dream power cable. I'm sorry, their speaker cables, which are like a white and a gold. And what I love about the Stealth is that these are the only cables. I mean, as we know, cables go on the floor, they go on risers, you can see them. These are the only cables that have ever been approved by my wife from a looks point of view, because our listening room is actually, it's our great room. It's a multi-use room. So guests and the wife actually see this, and she actually approves of the way the Stealth cables look. I mean, they are absolutely beautiful in person. There is no question about it. But today I'm going to talk about the 10 differences that I heard. And what we did is we actually we used a Luxman integrated. The retail on them is between $10,000 and $12,000. I actually had some friends, they brought over a Gryphon 300, which has now been discontinued for I believe the 333. And I think that's around $17,000 or $18,000. And we also did a Constellation integrated. One of my friends had one of those. That's right around $20,000. So we had a variety of price points. We first did the Luxman, and then the Gryphon, and then the Constellation. The Luxman was very good. I love the Luxman. It does a lot of things right. But the Constellation at almost double the price was a superior integrated in many ways. Having said that, and I don't want to ruin the surprise, we actually have some higher end integrateds and amps and preamps on the way, which are going to be double the price of the Luxman to triple the price of the Luxman. So that'll be great to hear. But at first we understood that the Gryphon and the Constellation, I hate to say better, were different, but they had a lot of positive attributes over the Luxman. Then what we did is we took, we did all base cables at that point. When I say base cables, I mean normal hi-fi brand cables that everybody is familiar with. Then what we did is we tried taking the cables out, we put the Luxman back in, and with the Luxman, I inputted I put into the system the Stealth tunable Ethernet in the Stealth double tunable USB. I'll link to those videos down below as well. And the combination of the Luxman with those two Stealth cables, which is considerably less expensive than, for instance, the Constellation, was actually a far superior sound than if we did just the Gryphon and the Constellation by itself. And for those tests, we did run the bass power cord then that they came with. Then what we did is we focused on the power cable. And we actually tried this power cable across all 3 units because I wanted to get a feel for what it did across a multitude of units versus a multitude of units. Yeah, I think I said that right. Versus just on the Luxman. So the top 10 differences that I noticed that I'm about to share with you were noticed across all 3. Problem I ran into is, I actually posted about this on my Facebook page. I got so swept up in the music that I literally could not focus enough to do critical listening and take notes. I think I ended up listening to music for 4.5 hours. I was really swept away by the system now that I've upgraded to the Stealth Ethernet, USB, power cable. And for me, I have 2 types of listening. I have the critical listening, but then I also have the subconscious listening. I reach a point where either before or after, I will shut off all my critical listening. I'll put down the pen and paper, and I'm then going to listen to, I'm going to call it subconsciously. And what I look for subconsciously is, without even knowing it, is my foot tapping along with the music. You know, am I kind of bobbing my head? Am I really feeling the ebb and flow in the music? I find that my subconscious listening tells me just as much about a gear, component, accessory, cable, as much as my critical listening. So I very distinctly use both those sides when I go into taking a look at something and how it sounds. The first is Above and Beyond / Liquid Love. It's the live version at the Hollywood Bowl by Above and Beyond. Very complex song. I urge all of you to watch the video along with then listening to it. I listened to it on Qobuz, their high res, because you're going to see in the video a lot of types of instruments that if your system is not dialed in just right, you're not hearing. And it helps and aids in knowing what you're hearing, what you're not hearing, what you're missing, and what's there. Second one is Holly Cole. Every Day Will Be a Holiday, off of one of her acoustically recorded albums, which I enjoy. The third one I used is off of the recently released Taylor Swift album. Yes, I know, Taylor Swift. It's a well-recorded album, though, on some of the songs. Her 10-minute version of All Too Well. And then I also added Buddy Guy and Junior Wells, their song, Give Me My Coat and My Shoes. Love that song. That song is really revealing because so many times it sounds flat and lifeless. And it actually takes a lot to get it sounding good. And then another one I used is an actual Broadway recording of Fiddler on the Roof. And what's great about that is I actually saw it live on Broadway. And on some of the songs, when they start moving around the stage and clapping and snapping and dancing, knowing where they should be going on the stage, it makes it easier for me to pick out. It's a great recording. It makes it easier for me to pick out what's going on, what isn't, what I should be hearing, and what I shouldn't. So that's the foundation. Those are the main songs we listen to. We listen to, obviously, to a lot of other ones, but those are songs that I've listened to I'm hundreds of times plus, maybe even thousands throughout the decade. So I'm extremely familiar with them. So now let's get into the top 10. All right, number 1 and number 2 kind of going together. I cheated. I gave you the highlight of number 1. The problem with number 1 is when I put this power cable in, I went to review it and I got sucked up in the sound of the music, and I couldn't do the review. So that was number 1 overall. Number 2, on the song Above and Beyond Liquid Love by Above and Beyond, the song Liquid Love, is that there is actually a harp in that song. And you can see it on the video, as I alluded to earlier, but on most systems, you only hear the harp come in and out. And for just for just a second, you're almost like, I think I heard the harp. Was that the harp? With this cable, I was able to clearly hear the harp, clearly delineate the harp. But what I liked about it is that it did not, I'm going to use a term, spotlight. Oftentimes, gear, tweaks, cables, in my mind, will artificially tip up to add more detail, to give you a false sense of detail. And they do that, and it kind of tricks you, and it's once you hear the problem is with that, and you hear a cable that gives you the detail and the naturalness without it, it's easy to spot. For me, I couldn't really spot that until I put in the Stealth, the Ethernet, and the USB cables into my system. Then I noticed what my other reference cable was doing in regards to that. So I was able to hear the harp throughout it. I could pick it out. It was beautifully there. It wasn't spotlighted. It wasn't unnaturally forward. It wasn't unnaturally bright. It was there, and it was integrated into the music. So it was a very beautiful presentation of that instrument without it being falsely tipped up or overly analytical. Number 3. The crowd in that same Above and Beyond song, which is one of the reference sounds that I use when I adjust the tunable cables, was more natural sounding, more effortless. It was not more detailed like some cables make it seem, but I learned when it becomes more detailed, that's because the cables are tipped up. It typically will have a more sharper, more trebly sound on other cables, whereas with the Stealth, it was just more naturally there. It just sounded more like an actual audience. You could still pick out individual voices and people clapping louder than others, but they sounded more natural with the natural peaks in regards to when somebody became louder or screamed or yelped versus everything being unnaturally higher and unnaturally pitched just to give you that false sense of detail. So whether it be that or whether it be in the snapping and the clapping on Fiddler on the Roof, which again, it sounded more natural. It sounded more like skin actually hitting skin versus a fake animated artificial sound that was added in the recording. It just sounded more harmonically correct. All right, number 4, I'm going to use a word that I hate, but it actually popped into my mind. I was like, oh my gosh, now I need to have to use this word in description that I hate. But voices and the music itself, like in the bass region, it had more gravitas to it. It seemed more wholesome, more cohesive, but it didn't sound muddy. It didn't sound tipped up artificially. It didn't sound bloated. It sounded like there was more actual human element and human touch to it versus it being artificial in any way. And I know I keep saying these cables are really natural sounding, but that is what you walk away with. At least I walked away across all the amps that we tried this on, that it was just much more relaxed, but still hard driving when it needed to be. It wasn't relaxed in the sense of, oh, okay, it's going to put you to sleep. No, not at all. It's still, when you need full throttle, it's full throttle. When I listen to my vocal trance, it's there. It rocks. It seems more like you're actually at the concert venue or at the rave or wherever you go. So it did have that difference. And what's interesting is we actually also tried the cable on our Aquila Scala DAC, which is from Italy, and it's a tube-based DAC. And I tried to see which one we liked better to see if there was a difference, whether it be in the gravitas or the naturalness. And it had a very different effect between the DAC and the amps. On the DAC, it gave an overwhelming sense of just liquidity and much less digital sounding. I thought this was a pretty not digital sounding. I'm using very technical terminology there, DAC to begin with, but the cable ended up really taking it up several notches in terms of sounding significantly less digital. It came down to, we had to vote to see which did we like it better in regards to, did we like it more in the DAC or more in the amp to continue the serious listening? And we almost couldn't tell because which one we liked better, because it made a dramatic effect in both. So I would say that, yeah, definitely a contender. You want to upgrade the DAC cable as well as with the amp cable. It would make a very big difference. All right, so now I'm going to merge 5 and 6 together. Number 5 is I had this overall sense of everything being more harmonious, everything being more in sync with each other and not competing with each other. So I liken it to a camera lens. When you are manually focusing a camera lens and you're going from blurry, 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 you think it's good, you think your system's good, and then you go just that little bit more, and all of a sudden, bam, everything is sharp and in focus. That's the overall sense I get with harmony, that the music wasn't fighting itself. The different instruments, the singers, they weren't fighting against each other for attention in the mix. They were working together. And I liken it to the difference between people who are familiar with live recordings or bands, for instance. You can almost always tell if a band has recorded all in one take together in the same room all at once. There's a different energy. They're feeding off each other more versus somebody that may have recorded the song in different studios around the world, and then it's put together, it's mixed together. It never quite has that same electric cohesiveness that the first one I described does. That was one of the things that I noticed. And in tying in with number 6, this was a big one for me. This was big. This put a big smile on my face. You hear a lot of people say, well, now the sound was projected forward of the speakers. I never got the sense that the sound was being projected forward of the speakers. Now, if you remember, when I did the USB cable, that made the sound seem bigger. The singers came out a little bit, much more three-dimensional, much more lifelike. But with the power cable in the mix, I felt like rather than the sound being pulled forward, I was being pulled into the sound, that I had somehow been moved up into the mix, and I was actually kind of surrounded by the music. It was a wonderful effect, and it was almost startling in that sense of, wow. It was a completely different experience for me, where it took away the often dimensionality of the sound that I had heard so many times, and it made it 3D in the sense of now I'm being pulled into the music. So yes, while I've heard gear and speakers and components and tweaks where the sound can come forward, I had not up till now experienced getting pulled into the sound. And the Stealth Dream 2020 power cable, in conjunction with the other Stealth cables, absolutely pulled me into the sound. All right, 7 and 8, they're going to go together again, as I did earlier. 7 for me was music just sounded like more of an event. It sounded like, whereas before it would kind of sound like, okay, yeah, it's a live recording. Now it's like, wow, you're at the live recording. And it really, that's part of number 6, where the sound, where you get pulled into the sound, but it just made more of a statement of you are here. And that ties in also to the next one. So when I use Give Me My Coat and My Shoes by Buddy Guy and Junior Wells, it's the first time on a speaker system versus headphones where I had heard that you could hear his individual strings. You could hear the strings had more difference to them. Same with Taylor Swift. Her guitar now, rather than just sounding like all the strings she was strumming were the same, you could hear her picking the strings. There was a new level of detail without anything being tipped up, without anything sounding artificial, without anything being spotlighted. And going back to Buddy Guy and Junior Wells, the harmonica was so much more fleshed out when he plays that harmonica. It sounds like now there's actually, you can hear so much more of the room reverb. And it sounds like, again, you've been actually put into that room with them versus you sitting at your house listening to a live recording. There was so much more subtlety and fleshed out nuances in the music that it just had a much more emotional impact to it than running the stock power cables. And I'm going to merge the last two together. I don't know, maybe I should have just made this the top 5 rather than the top 10. There was more ebb and flow, more rhythmic variation, whether it be Fiddler on the Roof. You could hear the flute and you could hear the other instruments. You could actually hear how they were changing their tempo and how they were contrasting with the other instruments. And there was more shading. That's a word I want to use. With the Stealth cable, there was more musical shading with the instruments, with the voices, with the overall presentation that did not exist at a way I could hear before. And it's almost like it's easy to turn up on your TV the saturation all the way. And that's good for about 2 seconds. But then you realize that it's almost like turning up the bass and treble. You've lost so much of the detail and so much of that shading and fineness that exists within well-recorded music. With this, it didn't turn up the bass and treble at all. Everything was presented well, but in a way, it's like you almost turn down that saturation. It's not, I know this isn't the best example because you didn't lose anything with it, but the fine details suddenly emerged more. The shading of the music emerged more. So rather than just bass and treble, rather than just punched up colors, you're getting everything that exists that was kind of in the back before that you couldn't hear, that you didn't know exist. It's now come out and you hear the variations of, some of the songs. All of a sudden I'm like, wow, there's actually 2 guitars playing, whereas before you couldn't pick up that subtle shading and the differences and the nuances. Suddenly it's all there, but again, it has not in any way, shape, or form artificially turned up the bass and the treble. Here's an example. The Luxmans have a direct feature. You flick that switch, it bypasses a lot of the circuitry, which does give you better sound. However, on the Luxman, what I don't like about that is that it can make it sound a little bit anemic at times. This gave me all the improvements of hitting that direct switch, like on the Luxman, of hearing the subtlety, of it being more correct, but I didn't lose anything in the process. And I think that's a real feat. I think that's a real feat when you talk about improving, and I don't want to say improving in the sense that it's this cable hasn't added anything. And that's the thing. A lot of people on these forums get hung up, oh, well, the cable shouldn't add, or I agree. This cable hasn't added anything. All the Stealth cables have simply allowed me to more naturally hear and enjoy and be engaged and engrossed with the music in a way that has not artificially added anything. I feel like it's now allowing me to hear the music and the recordings that were always there, that for a multitude of reasons we were never able to enjoy. So let me sum up the Stealth Dream 2020 cable. Yes, the thing's a monster. What's great is the connectors are wonderful. What I love about this connector is when you actually plug it in, it looks like it would be heavy, but it's not. When you plug it in, it goes in about 90% of the way, and then there's the last 10% where you really need to push it in because it locks in like no other connector I've had. And I've tried some pretty expensive power cables. So this is great in that regard. In fact, the first time we plugged it in the amps, we thought it was in all the way. And then we realized, because the amp actually shut off, that, okay, what's wrong? We hadn't pushed it in all the way. And it actually made a noticeable sound difference when you push it in. So you definitely want to put your hand in front of the amp, hold on here and push it in. Never pull out or push in on the cable itself. You always want to hold the connector, okay? If you're like my wife, she goes through 5 iPhone cables a year because she always pulls on the cable, and she wonders why they don't last. So you definitely want to do that right. I would say this in regards to upgrading your power cable. If you are, I'm going to go back to what I started with. I am now, Stealth has turned this upside down for me. I'm at the point where, frankly, I'm not really looking to test any other cables. I've been overwhelmed by cables for decades. I viewed them as an evil necessity. There's just so many to try. Most of them are mediocre. Some are good, some are decent. Many of them are overpriced. For me, guys, I don't sell anything. I don't get paid for this. This is my personal audiophile journey that I'm sharing with you. For me, my search is over. It simply becomes a matter of which Stealth do I get? I'm telling you, don't waste your time on any other cables. Go right to Stealth. If you don't have Stealth, you're missing out. That, in my opinion, after all the hundreds of cables I've heard over the years, it is that much of a difference. Regardless of price point of cable Stealth that I've heard, there is no other competition that comes close to it. So I feel comfortable in saying that even if you're at a more entry-level Stealth cable versus a higher end, you're going to see that performance. I flew to Indianapolis. I've heard, I don't even know, 10, 12 different cables by Stealth at all price points. They are beautiful and they are unmatched. And I have never said that about any component that I have ever owned, ever. And I'm saying, I'm going out on a limb and telling you that these cables are unmatched. So yes, this cable made a noticeable difference. Again, it goes back into the things of, once you take it out, you realize what you're missing without it. We did try it across a DAC. We tried it across multiple amps. It made a difference on everything. Getting the tunable collar in the right place is a big deal. I actually had my wife help me, and I would just have her keep moving it until we dialed it in. I've gotten good at this. At first, it would take me about an hour to tune in, an hour to an hour and a half to get the tunable cables right. I'm down now where I can, what I do is I'll get it in within about 20 minutes. I'll get it where it needs to be, and then I'll actually take a rest. Typically come back the next day, have her help me again, and verify where it needs to be. Because I find that after a while, I need to give my ears a rest, and sometimes you're overanalyzing it. So guys, check out the Stealth cables. I love this thing. I think this would be great for if you ever needed to tow a vehicle that was stuck in the mud. You could probably use this thing. This thing is a beast. It is just so well made. And the fact that it has a high wife acceptance factor, which I can't even say, along with the performance, Stealth, you've hit a home run with this.